World Environment Day on Now is brought to you by the Ministry of Planning and Development and the United Nations Development Programme.
Well, I am personally not a waste man. At least I've never been told I'm a waste man.
Different kind of waste, Gary. Different kind of waste.
Different kind of waste. But waste is, well, I can't just say waste is waste. There are different types of waste. And to speak with us about that this morning are my two guests from the Ministry of Planning and Development. So my one guest is Kima Gardner, who is a waste management specialist. And I also have Tushara Maraj, who is an environmental engineering specialist. So we're going to be speaking about waste and chemicals. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for being with us. This morning we've been learning so much, and we've been learning about so much we can do ourselves as individuals to help certain situations as pertains the environment, to the environment, and the ways in which we can conserve the environment as well as we lead up to World Environment Day coming up on the 5th. So first question, I'll ask you, Kima. Tell us about some of the things that are of international concern regarding chemicals and waste, and how does this affect the average citizen?
Sure. So again, thank you so much for having us, and good morning to your viewers. The waste and chemicals, which are listed under the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, and these are the international conventions that deal with this thematic area. And they have been so assigned because of the threat they pose to human health. They cause various issues, for example, potentially cancers, neurological disorders, immune disorders, developmental delays, etc. They also have impacts on the environment as well as on biodiversity. Of course, the theme for World Environment Day is ecosystem restoration. And so these wastes, particularly hazardous waste and toxic chemicals, can result in biodiversity loss, birth defects within these organisms, contamination of soil, air, and water, greenhouse gases, climate change, we were mentioned earlier as well. So the issue here is that some of these chemicals, for instance, and it's a particular group called persistent organic pollutants, which are so categorized because they are toxic, resulting in some of the effects I would have mentioned earlier. Right. They are also particularly vulnerable to certain populations. So for example, the elderly, children, women of childbearing age, pregnant women. And they are also persistent so that they take very long to break down within the environment, which means they can not only impact those populations, but also could potentially impact future generations as well. They also can bioaccumulate, which means they can concentrate within the fatty tissue of organisms. And in so doing, they then again cause these toxic effects I would have mentioned earlier as well. They are also highly mobile. And so it's possible for them to be found in places where they weren't even generated. And because of these issues, they are widespread, long-lasting, and detrimental to human health and the environment. So as citizens then at the international scale, it means that we have the potential to be exposed to these chemicals and hazardous waste as well. And, as well have these negative impacts affecting us as well as our natural environment.
And, it seems like a lot to wrap your head around when it comes to that kind of thing, because there are so many ways in which we are exposed to waste and waste products, some of which we may not be even aware. Tushara, what activities are being implemented here in Trinidad and Tobago to address some of the issues that were mentioned, and how do they benefit us and the global situation?
Hi, thanks for having me this morning. Just to go off of what my colleague had mentioned before on hazardous waste. So when we speak about waste in the multilateral environmental agreement realm, we speak directly to the Basel Convention on the transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal. Now, when the average citizen hears the term hazardous, they may automatically think industrial waste, petroleum-based waste stores, etc. And they won't be wrong. But what I think they need to recognize as well is that the more commonly based waste as well can be categorically hazardous, such as plastic waste and things like electronic waste, which is like mobile units, our PCs, and these sorts of things. So what was recognized globally was that there was a growing trend in developed states moving their waste from their home state to lesser developed countries as a means of disposal. So in combating this issue, the Basel Convention was established. And within the Basel Convention, they set up a set of procedures known as the prior informed consent procedures, which essentially ensures that there is written and formal notification and consent granted from all parties involved in any sort of transshipment of these wastes. This included the export states, any transit states, and the import states as well. So what this essentially means for the average citizen is that at this level, we are ensuring that there is environmental regulation, there are checks and balances in place being taken so that we don't have any illegal or drastic ramifications environmentally, not only biophysically, but socioeconomically as well, because we do have coastal communities, we do have fisheries division as well. And the EMA, as our national competent authority, is in charge and responsible for receiving and responding to these notifications.
Right.
So a system like this is what we need and what we have in place.
Now, you mentioned earlier about larger nations dumping their waste into smaller developing and underdeveloped countries. You know, I've seen reports in the past, like last year, and so of, you know, certain large countries. I wouldn't name the country, but dumping their waste into like the Philippines and things like that. Do we have any issue with that here in Trinidad and Tobago, where larger nations are dumping their waste into our waters into our environment?
Well, as mentioned before, due to the system that we do have integrated into our existing regulatory system, we prevent against these things. The EMA are very judiciously working with the Customs and Excise Division as well as the Trade Licensing Unit to avoid these types of situations. All notifications usually take place and verification of all documentation and stuff will be used to avoid these types of situations.
Well, thankfully, there is litigation in place to try to avoid and to address situations like that. So hopefully, it's not something that we see prevailing here, at least in Trinidad and Tobago. And well, hopefully, it will stop worldwide. Kima, let's jump back to that topic you were speaking on when it comes to the ways in which chemicals that are in the environment affect us badly. And you spoke specifically to there being chemicals that may accumulate in the body over time. Could you identify some of the ways in which certain chemicals can enter our system and actually accumulate over time and cause more harm over time?
Sure, no problem. So I would have mentioned before, for example, these POPs bioaccumulate or they concentrate in the fatty tissue of organisms. And
Right.
so one possible route then is through consumption of food, particularly fatty foods. And so we find that because these POPs are fat loving, if you consume large quantities of food containing or fatty foods, that's one possibility. There's also potentially as well through your water sources, through contamination, and then through the use of your household consumer products, because a lot of these POPs are actually put or used within the normal household consumer sector because of their beneficial uses. So for example, we have brominated flame retardants. That's one category of POPs. And these are used in your electronics, for instance. And they are put in there to slow or to reduce the flammability of products or to reduce the spread of fire potentially, right? And so we have electronics, they're used also in mattresses for the same purpose, in textiles, in foam within your cars, etc. We also have, for instance, through your cookware, where we have another category of POPs. So these are PFOS, and they are used because of their properties for stain repellent, for oil repellent, for water resistance. And so these type of chemicals can be used in your household products, such as your carpets, in your textiles as well, certain types of clothing, and firefighting foam because of that suppressant property of these chemicals. And then there are also activities that you can engage in that may potentially release POPs from these products. So for example, if you're open burning your waste in the backyard, then that's one way then that these same chemicals that are used at the household level, if you're then burning them, then these chemicals get released into the atmosphere and then could potentially affect us. Additionally, there's also my colleagues before in the biodiversity section and land degradation segment would have mentioned the use of pesticides. This is another avenue as well. Of course, we're trying to promote the home gardening, etc. And so persons may potentially be using pesticides, but may not be doing so in a judicious manner. So that's another avenue as well through which you can be contaminated.
Yeah, I've seen videos in like school when I was studying what do you call it? Science, something science in primary school. I can't remember the name of it right now. Integrated science in primary school. So long ago, right? Where they said, the pesticides and these things that they use, and then rain falls and it washes into the rivers and seas, and then we go consume the fish and stuff like that. Is that something that is still very prevalent here in Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, you see with pesticides, because it's a non-point source pollutant, meaning that you can't necessarily verify where the source of the pollution comes from, it definitely is a potential source of pollution nationally. Now, in the case of POPs pesticides, however, the chemicals that have been listed under the Stockholm Convention for these pesticides have actually either been banned in Trinidad and Tobago, deregistered. So, for example, DDT is quite a popular pesticide. Persons know it's used for vector control for mosquitoes that cause malaria, for instance. That would have been deregistered in 1990, or they would have been possibly never registered. So the chemicals that are currently listed under the Stockholm Convention in terms of the pesticides at the national scale, those are controlled by the Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Inspectorate. So in that regard, we're okay with the Stockholm Convention pesticides. However, there will be other pesticides that will not fall under the convention, but of course may be used. And in that case, we'd like to encourage persons to try and avoid using pesticides. For one, look at, for example, using integrated pest management, which is more biological controls for the management of pests, looking towards using compost in place of chemical fertilizers, etc.
Hopefully, we can all do our part. And speaking of which, I just want to ask Tishara quickly, just in bullet points, because we don't have much time left. What are some of the easy things that the individual can do at home to help reduce their waste and the way in which they affect the environment, not only with solid waste that we have at home, but with things like emissions as well?
Well, I think we just need to revert back to what we've learned from school. The 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. It's the easiest thing to remember, and it can be the most effective. So reduce the use of our single-use plastics as far as possible, the utensils, the bottles. Then if we do have to use it, make sure that you try to reuse multiple uses out of the product. And then if those two options are exhausted and we do need to recycle, we have the capabilities down here in the form of Simcoe's beverage container recycling facility, the iCare program. Do some source separation at home. Pull out your recyclables before you put them into your garbage bags to head to the landfill. And as Kima mentioned, composting, we can look into that. Everyone is at home now, so we can start a little compost at home using the organic waste from our kitchen, the kitchen scraps. These sort of things would have an impact because it's individual action leading to a collective change, essentially.
I love how you put that. And with that, I want to thank both my guests for joining me this morning and educating us, educating all the viewers as well, because I'm sure somebody out there learned something. I know I definitely did. So I want to thank you, Kima Gardner, Waste Management Specialist. I want to thank you as well, Tishara Maraj, Environmental Engineering Specialist with the Ministry of Planning and Development. Have a great morning, and thank you one more time.
Thank you so much for having us again.
All right, we're going to take that break. It's the last one for the morning before we go to our closing moments on the All Morning Show. So stay right where you are. We'll be right back.
Commemorating World Environment Day on Now is brought to you by the Ministry of Planning and Development and the United Nations Development Programme.